Just moments ago, we received an official update from Air India on some of the information that the corporation Air India knows about Air India Flight 171. In addition, after my video on Vapor Lock posted about 2.5 days ago, that got over 400,000 views, we've seen multiple other YouTube channels start talking about the theory of Vapor Lock. In this video, we're going to give an update on that, but I'm actually going to give you some insight into what may be even more of a probable cause for the Air India 171 accident based on new information that's since come out. Now, in case you're not familiar, I'm Meet Kevin. I'm the owner, operator, and pilot in command of this Phenom 300E, a dual-engine jet. In this video, we're going to touch on, first, the latest updates from Air India. Air India just provided in an interview with the Times of India information on the engines. The right engine was new and installed as of March of 2025. So, in other words, less than 2 months old at the time of the accident. And the left engine was, quote, last serviced in 2023. Typically, an engine is going to get overhauled every 5,000 to 10,000 hours, so this may not be unusual. Though using the word service might be a bad translation since engines are serviced with oil, I think they might be referring to overhaul here, but that translation might be lost. The CEO of Air India indicates, quote, no safety concerns that were raised on this 787-8 prior to the crash. There were no known maintenance issues or red flags, which stands in contrast with some of the rumors we've heard online that this plane has had maintenance issues in the past. We've seen video of the air conditioning not working in the cabin on the ground, people suggesting these planes, specifically this aircraft, has had issues with sort of the cabin cooling or cabin electrical systems for the little computer, computer screens that you see in front of your seat and glitching out or not functioning. But the CEO, at least at the moment, suggests no known maintenance issues or red flags, that Air India has been coordinating with Boeing at the, quote, highest levels, and has also coordinated with GE regarding the GE NX engines, regarding any potential known issues. Now, this is entirely possible here that the CEO is just sort of washing their hands of, hey, we didn't know anything, this is a terrible tragedy, we've got both black boxes recovered, so TBD, what information is revealed and released from this. But what we should do right now is catch you up to speed on why Air India 171 could have crashed and what we know about this accident. First, we know that the ram air turbine was deployed. We can audibly hear the deployment of the ram air turbine, and we can see it. Now, at this point, we're going to assume we're already accepting of this information, and this information suggests that an electrical failure or a dual engine failure is heavily likely. Catching you up, since this incident occurred 6 days ago now, it's highly believed that a dual engine failure is the likely cause of the Air India 171 crash. But the question is, what would cause a dual engine failure? We already know the ram air turbine, a little spinning turbine that gives you the opportunity to potentially restart your engines or operate some basic electrical equipment at higher altitudes, like cruise altitudes, could be useful, but not very useful at 400 to 600 feet, which is all this aircraft was able to climb to, unfortunately, before crashing. We also know that there are rumors around potentially the pilots setting up the flaps instead of the gear, retracting the wrong lever, essentially. This seems unlikely based on on-the-ground footage of the wings of the aircraft appearing like they're set to a flaps 5 setting, suggesting the flaps were never fully retracted despite this rumor. We do see potential evidence that the gear was indeed commanded up, but never actually fully went up. In fact, Gary B. Pilot has a great video on this where he shows what the typical gear retraction mechanism looks like on a Boeing 787. He's a first officer, and he plays a clip here of once that gear is commanded up, the Boeing 787 actually tilts the tires while opening the board doors before retracting the actual gear of the aircraft. And based on the footage that we could see, the crash footage, some of the higher resolution crash footage and the different angles, It's currently believed that the gear was indeed commanded up. So it doesn't seem like, while it's still possible, it doesn't seem like pilot error was one of the large contributing factors here, at least not regarding the gear or the flaps, based on the limited information we can have at this moment. So this is where we get to the topic of vapor lock and potential electrical issues. Now, a lot of people have a lot of issues with vapor lock, and we're going to talk about vapor lock in just a moment. But what I'd like to do is first talk about the potential of a catastrophic engine failure here. But you see, one of the things that we know is that when we have a dual engine failure or an electrical failure, we're going to get that deployed ram air turbine, which is exactly what we saw and we heard. In fact, we remember that Blancolirio has a fantastic video comparison where he shows the ram air turbine deployed, or at least the sound of the ram air turbine being deployed. And this being something that we can listen to very closely to hear, okay, that's a distinct sound of the ram air turbine deployment. I'll save your time and not rehash some of this older information by showing video clips and that. We could see that in prior videos. What matters more is now what would cause a dual engine failure. And so there are a few things that could cause a dual engine failure. Let's for a moment start with an electrical and FADEC issue. Now, this is potentially a very convincing argument as to why the Boeing 787 could have had a complete loss of thrust. That we didn't necessarily lose our engines, since we didn't see smoke or flames coming out of the rear side of the engines. While it's possible the engines simply simultaneously flamed out because of a fuel issue or vapor lock, which we could talk about, it seems possible that thrust was simply lost as the FADEC, or the Full Authority Digital Engine Control Unit, potentially reset to some kind of failsafe reversion, which is, in English, a way of saying this. Imagine you're driving a car and you have your foot halfway down, so pedal halfway down to the metal, right? And you're like, cool, I should be accelerating. But then all of a sudden a computer says, uh-oh, there's some kind of sensor or data issue. We're resetting your throttle to 0. So now your foot's halfway on the pedal and you're like, where did all my engine power just go? My foot's halfway down the pedal. Now, of course, we might, let's push, the first reaction might be to push down more or to push the throttle forward on the plane. But that could be where we have to get into spontaneous emergency procedures for resetting FADEC control that we don't know if those procedures were properly trained, properly followed, or if it was even possible in the limited time this aircraft was airborne to reset the FADEC system, that Full Authority Digital Engine Control System. So in other words, as the gear was commanded up, it is possible that there was a sudden surge of power in the electrical system, leading to some form of sensor failure or some form of ECC failure. This would be your engine control center failure, where you have some form of catastrophic cascade of electrical failures. We're not just talking about a breaker popping here, but some kind of electrical failure that happens at the same time as you go command, gear up, some form of bizarre electrical power surge that resets the FADEC, basically resetting your throttle to 0. So in other words, the engines didn't fail, potentially in this theory, but the control system, the computer that controls the throttle, may have failed. In our Phenom, for example, we also have a FADEC, which means when we move the throttle, we're not moving a cable, we're not moving any kind of fuel valve, we're simply telling the computer we want more throttle. Well, if there's a catastrophic computer failure on takeoff, or some kind of electrical failure that leads to that, we might command throttle and get no throttle until that FADEC is reset, which would be a critical phase of flight to have such a failure. In addition, if it happened at the same time as we commanded the gear up, but the gear isn't fully retracting because that electrical failure hits at roughly that same time, now we have the drag of our gear down and no thrust produced by a full weight engine on a hot day when we need all the performance we can get, fewer air molecules, slower climb rate. And unfortunately, this is where we see in the video, it looks like the aircraft, it doesn't stall out, nose down. It just simply looks like it loses lift, which is almost why some people are starting to suggest, could this potentially have been some kind of malicious action, that maybe either a pilot accidentally fell on the throttle and pulled the throttle back. That's a rumor that's going around. I find that somewhat unlikely. Some people are saying maybe this was malicious and they just pulled the throttle back. But frankly, if this was a malicious intention of downing this plane, you probably wouldn't be nose up. You'd probably be nose down or accelerating into some form of malicious case. So I really find that to be an unlikely theory. Though let's be real, everything gets a percentage chance. But this new information about the gear potentially being commanded up, functioning, and then all of a sudden freezing could potentially suggest that an engine failure was caused by some kind of catastrophic electrical failure that led the gear not to complete its gear up motion. Suddenly you get the complete electrical failure that leads to a failure or a reversionary mode of the FADEC, basically resetting the FADEC, the full authority digital engine control, resetting it to 0. Meanwhile, the pilots are unaware of why all of a sudden they lost all thrust. They are likely pushed the FADEC forward rather than even having time or going through the procedures to reset. Frankly, there was not even enough time to pull out a quick reference handbook to figure out, why did I just lose FADEC control? How am I going to reset this? And it's unlikely that losing FADEC control is a memory item in the Boeing 787. This also doesn't appear to be a single engine failure because we don't see the aircraft yaw to one side. Typically, in an engine failure, you're going to rapidly yaw to one side. This looks like you simply lose dual thrust at the same time. In fact, I have a video where I can simulate an engine failure, a single engine failure for you, just so you can see this. Now, mind you, the video that I'm going to show you is from training when I was brand new at flying jet. And so the instructor is going to pull back where the little hand here is. It's going to pull back on one of the throttles to simulate an engine failure. And you should see the front of the plane. You see that yaw right there? That's a substantial yaw on a takeoff that I then have to counter with rudder. And the reason is my right engine loses thrust. And in that loss of thrust, my left engine is now overpowering the aircraft. So my aircraft flying straight loses thrust in the right. I get more push from the left engine, and we get that yaw, which is not what you see in the Air India crash, suggesting this was not a single engine failure. This was a dual engine failure. And I know there are a lot of rumors around, oh, well, perhaps the pilots made a mistake and simply pulled the wrong lever. I suppose this is possible, but I don't think it would lead to a catastrophic failure of complete thrust here. Even if I leave the gear down, I've done plenty of emergency procedure takeoffs where we do 50-foot go-arounds, and we purposefully leave the gear out to see how the aircraft would handle with the gear out in training, and it just isn't an issue. Even with misconfigured flaps, it's really unlikely that it would lead to such a catastrophic, here's me going for the gear handle right here. It's really unlikely that we would get a catastrophic result on this takeoff for the Air India accident. So this is why electrical failure seems to be a little bit more likely, leading to a FADEC reset or a computer control failure. So this is where, I've put together a little bit of a menu of what I think the odds of this dual engine failure are. So I think the dual engine failure is almost certain here. Not a single for the lack of yaw we saw. Theories causing dual engine failure. We don't see birds, so we're going to put that at less than 10%. Pilot error, the flap gear mistake, the falling on the throttle, the thrust issue, some kind of, intentional issue potentially here, like malicious. I put that at under, a 13% chance, maybe even lower. We'll talk about vapor lock in just a moment. There's obviously the potential for maintenance issues, give that maybe about a 15% chance. But I actually believe a greater chance than the vapor lock theory that I kind of introduced to the scene. Nobody was talking about vapor lock until I started talking about it, mind you. I'm not trying to take credit for that. I'm just trying to say, like, the idea here is to walk through these ideas, and as we get more information, revise. So this FADEC control failure is very likely, given the lack of flame out that we see out of the end, or the failure to see any kind of movement in yaw, suggesting an uneven failure of the engines. And it is reiterated by the deployment of the ram air turbine, and then of course the lack of engine thrust. Now, what about vapor lock? Everybody started talking about vapor lock after this video that I did right here, critical new data, engine, vapor lock engine failure. And we talk about that as a potential, right? And so we've got a few videos that came out. This is the first time I saw CaptainSteeeve talk about vapor lock. Let's see here.
So I totally agree with that. What's the theory? Have you heard about this vapor lock theory?
So let me throw out another one to you. Okay.
Okay.
So it's 40. I saw one METAR line that said it was 43 Celsius there. That's like 110 or 112 degrees. That's really hot.
Right.
All right. So they're going to have a much longer takeoff roll as a result of that.
And this is where they kind of first initially start talking about vapor lock, talked about the gear over here. And then this is actually where CaptainSteeeve really goes into talking about vapor lock. And he has a whole segment on it. Take a listen.
Just asking me to explain to all of you what vapor lock is. Okay. Again, you can big P, small p with vapor lock if you want. There's going to be lots of strong opinions about vapor lock, but we can't exclude vapor lock completely. Now, a lot of folks, let me answer the possible objections about vapor lock before I get into what it is. Some of the objections are, oh, that only happens in piston engines, or that only happens in carbureted engines. It doesn't make any difference what type of engine we're talking about. This is something that happens to the fuel before it reaches the engine. So it can happen in a turbine engine, it can happen in a recip, it can happen in a piston engine, carbureted or non-carbureted. It can happen in every type of engine because it's something that happens to the fuel. Now, I've got a great article here. I want to read it to you. I got to put my glasses on because I've been going for about 20 hours straight.
This is basically where he gets into talking about the potential for vapor lock and how it can happen in jet engines. And I'll give a quick explanation of this using actually, a liquid here. I've got a colored vegetable oil here, and this is really just to give a visualization. So I don't actually believe, and I want to be clear about this, I don't actually believe this is the primary likely cause anymore of the Air India crash. Like I said, as I've posted here, I think it's less than a 20% chance that vapor lock or this fuel issue contributed to a dual flame out of both of the engines, but it definitely is a chance, and CaptainSteeeve provides an update on exactly the vapor lock that we introduced to the scene. But let's explain it quickly. Typically, you have a pressurized system. Imagine I squeeze this bottle really hard, and I always basically have this oil or fuel, and in the case of a jet engine, it'd be jet fuel, pressured. The lines are always going to be pressured, right? So imagine I'm pushing at the back. Okay, these are our fuel pumps. Fuel pumps are electrically driven. Is it possible that we had a dual fuel pump failure? Of course, absolutely possible that we had a dual fuel pump failure because of some catastrophic electrical issue. But this seems like it would be odd because we also have battery backups, right? We switch to batteries. I can, while I'm flying, I don't do this while I'm flying, I do it during my testing on the ground, but I can push a button called electrical emergency, and I will cut off every bit of electricity to any non-essential component of the plane, and I can run off my batteries and my backup batteries for 30 to 40 minutes, and I can still fly the plane and have my primary flight displays and whatever equipment that I need through a simulated electrical emergency. My fuel pumps are going to operate under this situation. Again, this is why it's so interesting that potentially could you have had a FADEC failsafe reversionary mode where thrust goes to 0 based on the computer due to some electrical failure or sensor failure seems much more likely than a dual fuel pump failure, because fuel pumps are going to provide pressure. When you lose your fuel pumps, though, you go to a suction-based system, which is basically the engine is sucking fuel And that vacuum that it creates essentially pulls fuel into the engine, which basically there are little sprayers inside of the actual engine that atomize the fuel and ignite to create thrust inside of the turbine, right? Now, if the suction system, which is, all no longer pressurized, you no longer have somebody pushing at the end, you're just operating now on a fuel line that's operating off of suction, which is fine. But what happens on very high heat days where inside of the cabin, you're also not operating the air conditioning, which is what we had seen during the pre-takeoff on tarmac footage of the plane? Is it possible you have vapor lock because the cooling is not enabling fuel lines inside the fuselage of the plane to be properly cooled? Possible. I still give it a smaller likelihood because, our wings are obviously separate. Yes, we get heat from the ground. The unused fuel recirculates back into the tanks, which can warm this up. But these are all normal procedures. So you'd really, on takeoff, have to imagine that the fuel lines became so hot that they vaporized the jet fuel, which can happen. Less likely than, obviously, on a piston engine, but can happen. You vaporize, so you create water in the fuel pump line. Now you lose your fuel pump, both engines' fuel pumps, and you're left with suction. Now you go take off with vapor in the line, and then what happens when you're nose high? See that? As you're nose high, only operating off suction without pressure, you potentially get a momentary loss of fuel, right? As your nose high tilting on your climb, that vapor leads to a temporary flame out. Unfortunately, you're not going to have enough time to relight the engines. So is it possible? Yeah. I don't think it's as probable as a FADEC control issue based on the deployment of the RAT, because we wouldn't necessarily have had a RAT deployment until later in the sequence, where you actually lost a fuel flow to both engines. It looked like you had no yaw, which implies that they shut down at exactly the same time, which would also be weird that both engines perfectly vapor locked at exactly the same time with no yaw, and that RAT came out so quickly, which may have taken longer had you had a flame out versus an immediate electrical failure. So this is why I'm now reducing the odds for some form of vapor lock issue, and I'm heavily focusing with, in my opinion, and obviously we'll see when the black box data comes out, but in my opinion, some form of fail-safe reversion to zero thrust and an inability to reset the FADEC to get thrust back. And it also aligns with what we hear about a potential Mayday call that indicated no thrust, no power. Both of those align. So that's my latest on what's going on with the Air India crash update, and hopefully it puts together some of the pieces of the puzzle. Obviously, as more data comes out, we'll keep providing more updates, so follow for more.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.